Kia ora, guys. When you watch this, if you watch this, it will be Anzac Day, or possibly a little bit after Anzac Day. It's not Anzac Day at the moment. It's not after Anzac Day either. It's quite a long way in advance of Anzac Day, but we're in the mid-semester break at this present point in time. I'm going to be heading off on annual leave next week. Anzac Day falls on the Monday, so we don't have a lecture, but because week 7 is the start of a new module, Matt thought, Pete and Janelle, we all thought that it would be a good thing to have something that prepares you for the subsequent 2 weeks of that module. But some of you will go to the effort of listening to this anyway, so it's worth pursuing. I think what I'm going to do is just talk through I'm going to talk through the conceptual template for this module, and then I'm going to talk at much more length about some history. I know that I've referred to these issues before in at least two other topics that we've had in the course, but I find that telling stories about personal histories is one of the ways in which you can make what I would otherwise find quite complex and challenging issues. You kind of bring them down to life size. You bring them into the home, and I find it a lot easier to approach what might otherwise be slightly abstract concepts and considerations and so on. So I'm going to do that. I'll talk about farms and constabularies and various other things, but I want to talk about that in the context of week 7's topic, which is on physical places. It's specifically about home, which is a word I think that functions at different scales, most obviously in the home here, wherever that might be for you, if in fact you have one, and for some of you, home is not a comfortable place, notwithstanding the normative connotations that word often, the kind of emotional work, the labour that term often carries out. But I want to talk about home in a slightly different way, and I also want to connect to one of the 2 videos that you have available to you in week 7. I'm not sure how many of you look at the weekly videos, but they're really helpful for a bunch of reasons. So what I'm going to do shortly is share the screen. I'm going to record the PowerPoint slideshow and the presentation, and then I'll whack it up on, I think I'll just put it up on YouTube and then post that link in the discussion forum or the class forum so that you can have a look at this thing if you wish to. So look, I hope that I'm going to pretend it is after the mid-semester break. I hope your mid-semester breaks went well. I hope that you found time to relax, or at least to take your mind away from university work. I hope you're healthy. I hope you made at least a bit or a lot of a start on your Voices essay. And we'll talk about those in the tutorials this week, in other words, when you're back face to face. And I will see you again on Monday for week 8. Janelle, Pete and Matt will see you at the tutes. And on those notes, let's make a start. Okay, here we are, week 3, module 3. So we are just tipping past the halfway point in the course. We've done the faces module, and we've done the faces module, and now this is where I need somebody to remind me because it's late on the Thursday. Places, stories, faces and voices. Thank you very much. And now we're into places. And this is what this one is about. What we do in this module over the next 3 weeks is look at 3 different environments: home and the university as an institutional environment. And we will look at digital environments as well. So I suppose spatially, we're looking at 3, and in terms of scale, we're looking at 3 different kinds of places. And what we are interested in this module are the ways in which our interactions with other people in these places have a bearing upon our sense of self. And in particular, probably a little bit less so in this one, certainly this will be a feature of topic 8 and topic 9. We go looking for the expectations, the shared expectations, some of which are conventional, some of which are a little stronger, some of which are rules that shape the ways in which we interact in these different environments. Some of those things are highly codified, some of them are not. Some of them are just things that you learn. And part of the challenge, I think, certainly in the first several weeks at a university, is getting your head around the informal rules of engagement that aren't written down anywhere, but they have very material effects. They structure relationships between people, and part of the discomfort and or the excitement or the challenge associated with being at a university is learning what they are. And they differ from place to place, but there are a lot of them that structure your interactions with me, with Janelle, with Pete, with Matt, with other people in your classes, with people with whom you share flats or hostels or whatever the case may be. Those are just some instances from universities. So we look for the things that structure the encounters that we have in those places and which help shape our sense of who we are. What will be a particular feature of this class that I'm doing now, the session, is the extent to which the physical and or online environments in which we interact with others are characterized by the absence or the presence of power. And to the extent that they are characterized by the presence of power, we are interested in who has that power, who might not have it, who benefits, who might not benefit. And we're also interested, finally, in the ways in which people's sense of belonging to a community plays out in these different places. And whether or not we all enjoy equivalent opportunities to demonstrate membership of different communities of interest that might be place specific. So that's broadly speaking, those are the touch points. Those are the things that we will work through in the context of a session on home or place, physical place, the university place, in an online environment. There are a couple of things that I think you might also want to do if you have time this week. Read the chapter, certainly. I'm also going to upload the lecture notes that Juliana Mansfeld, who's a good friend and a colleague of mine, and a woman with whom I first taught this course back at the 4 times. I'm going to load her notes up. She did the class last year, and so I will put her PowerPoint slides up. So you'll get this recording, you get Juliana's slides, there's the course text. There are 2 videos. They're quite different. They both speak to place and to notions of home. One of those, Trudy Kane's video, Trudy also taught this course on the Albany campus, is about the physical home, the place that many and perhaps most of us think of when we hear the word home. And she looks at home in a constructively critical way, and she asks some questions. She introduces some useful concepts and she asks some questions. And one of the concepts that she introduces is the notion, and it appears in the course text as well, is the notion of ontological security, the normative idea that a home is a place in which many of us expect but don't always find all of the time or some of the time. A sense of security. It's the place we come to and we breathe out, where we can be ourselves and feel as if we are safe, secure, grounded, whole. That is not, I don't know, does anybody feel like that all the time when they are at home? I'm not entirely sure. I certainly don't. I wouldn't characterize my relationships with homes, and I think that is a divisible concept, it's plural, as one in which I always feel ontologically secure. I would imagine that many people have felt rather insecure, particularly during lockdowns, where the incidence of domestic violence has increased and spiked for some communities. Questions of home ownership or the absence of ownership, high rental costs, financial insecurity, precarity, all of those things have negative consequences upon the capacity for people to experience ontological security. And so Trudy asks questions about that. She's also really good, because she's a sociologist, so she's just great at this stuff, on working through the kinds of rules and norms and accepted understandings and conventional ways of being that structure behavior and interactions within homes. And she talks about the extent to which home is a function of the stuff that you have around you, and the extent to which that material stuff is either experienced as something that grounds you at home, or is perhaps something that is a weight and a burden. And she asks some questions about what happens when you leave home. So that's a really, that's quite an intimate, in a sense, a private space take. Mehana Duri, who was at the time the video that you will see of him filmed, the head of the School of Māori Knowledge, Te Pūtahi Atoi, he's since moved on from that position. He's now the Deputy Vice Chancellor Māori. So he is the most important Māori academic in the institution. Mehana's approach is different. Mehana comes at this into and out of Te Ao Māori, and so he will just quietly and in his very gentle and compelling way talk about the significance of notions of whenua and the extent to which understandings of home and of Turanga Waewae in particular in Te Ao Māori are grounded in the land. That's really important for what I'm about to say, and that point will become clearer, I hope. And he talks us through some of those connections between the land and senses of whakapapa and identity and so on. And it's not my place to wax lyrical about that, except I would say that he is just a lovely person to listen to. He's a beautiful speaker, and he has things to say which, I've heard Mehana speak on these kinds of issues in many different contexts over quite a considerable period of time. He's always worth listening to. Again, he's worth listening to. He's worth re-listening to. Always something new to learn from Mehana. So watch those two videos, read the text, and put all of it alongside of what I'm about to say. What I would like to say is, it has to do with the idea that place, just bear with me, I've got a little light blinking and I'm just going to make sure that, yeah, it is, okay, sorry. I thought my computer was going to run out of battery and kind of crash, but it's not. Okay, on script, again, after a wee digression. I want to talk, some of this will be a little familiar to you, you'll have forgotten the detail, but there is more to be done. I want to talk about some aspects of my personal history and the stories that my family tell themselves about our sense of identity, who we are, where we come from. But and so this is place-based, but I want to talk about the land. Back to Mehana's point, the land on which a particular family, I use the terminology of Pākehā, you can choose whatever terminology you want. I want to talk about the history of the land on which a Pākehā people constructed a sense of themselves and a sense of home. Now, when we talk about home in this context, what I'll be talking about is quite a big place. 3 specific farms, the area of Taranaki, which I call the coast, the province, the former province of Taranaki. So I'm not talking about a specific house. This is my home at the moment, has been for 30 years, and it's in Palmerston North in the Manawatu. But I still feel a very strong sense of home when I drive through Hawara and head into the south of the Taranaki coast. So I want to talk about home from that point of view, and I want to talk about the way in which my family, my broader family, have created that sense of self. It's a very settled story. It's a coherent story. It makes sense. But behind that story is circumstances which are unsettling and which, as I grow older and become a little wiser and learn to hold my peace and listen to what other people have to say and become a little more open to other people's histories and other people's stories, I have simply become aware that my sense of home sits on top of a foundation that is unsettled. So I want to put this alongside of Trudy's focus on the home as almost literally a structure with bedrooms and bathrooms and food areas and so on, the kind of private space. And somewhere in between that and Mehana's references to Turanga Waewae and the whenua, and I want to drop in another scale at which we can talk about notions of home. And in particular, I want to start with this guy here. You've seen this photo. I think we've met this man briefly before. He is my great-grandfather. His name is Andrew Hurley. He's the photo here, which was taken in 1881. He is the captain of the Armed Constabulary rugby team. The team is about to play. They clearly haven't played because they look sort of relaxed and quite clean, but they are about to play a game on the Rahutu domain. Rahutu is a small town of which not much now remains, several kilometres away from Parihaka. And he's there because he's a member of the Armed Constabulary, having joined up in 1877 and having helped construct the lighthouse the Cape Lighthouse and having helped construct the South Road between Okatu and Upaniki, which is built for the express purposes of opening up the land for settlement. And it carries the armed constabulary to the gates of Parihaka. I'm just going to make an assumption. It's probably contested, or at least maybe one that isn't entirely safe to make, but I'll make it anyway. I'm going to make an assumption that you know that there was a place called Parihaka. It was established in 1866 by two great pacifist leaders, Te Whiti o Rongamai and Tohu Kākei, both men of the faith, both men of Taranaki and Te Atiawa Iwi. I'm assuming that you know that Parihaka became a pan-tribal place of refuge, particularly for Māori whose land had been taken from them, confiscated under the 1863 New Zealand Settlement Act and the 1863 Suppression of Rebellion Act, particularly Māori who came from the Waikato and the Bay of Plenty and other parts of Taranaki, where very substantial tracts of land were confiscated. Many of those people who were dispossessed had their social and economic and political means of livelihood destroyed because the whenua was taken from them, which is the entire point that Mehana is making, came to Parihaka. And in 1881, Parihaka was a big place. It had a bank, it had a bakery, it had extraordinary kitchens that could feed up to 4,000 people a month. And people would come on a monthly basis on the day known now as Tara, listen to Te Whiti o Rongamai in particular. So it became a really powerful and important place in which Māori leadership was exercised, which considerations of Māori autonomy were discussed, and which talk was held about what could or should be done to resist the confiscation in particular of Māori land. Parihaka became an absolute thorn in the side of the colonial administration, not because of any physical threat, because what you will know, I'm sure, is that it was based upon notions of non-violence. Sometimes the word passive resistance is used. I wonder if that's a misnomer, because the resistance was extraordinarily active, but it was non-violent. And you will have read, or you will read about the campaigns by the ploughers and the fencers. So there's really creative and imaginative ways of resisting the physical force and presence of the state, which were articulated by Te Whiti and Tohu and implemented by their people. And they were hard. They were hard to deal with from the state's point of view, because they were unconventional and they were fast and they were sharp and they were imaginative and they moved on the ground quickly. And to cut a very troubling story short, and one that I really would encourage you just to take a little bit of time to read about and reflect on if you're not familiar with it, and I certainly wasn't until not that terribly many years ago, so you have the jump on me. On the 5th of November in 1881, my grandfather and 1,588 other men, around about 700 of whom were from the armed constabulary, lined up outside the pa. They were welcomed in with food, baked bread, and haka and waiata and so on. There was an invasion of the pa. The riot act was read out. Te Whiti o Rongamai, Tohu Kākei, and a third man called Hiroki were arrested. Hiroki was subsequently executed in New Plymouth Jail, charged and convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of a man down near the Waitutara Valley some years earlier. The place was invaded over a period of 2 months. 250 or so houses were torn down. Hundreds of acres of cultivated land were destroyed. Women were raped, things were stolen. It was a very violent despoliation of a place of non-violence. And then it was occupied for 4 or 5 years. I can't remember if I've made this point before, but it came as a complete surprise to me to discover that Parihaka was more than just an invasion day story. It was an occupation story as well. And what you can see on that hill over there, one of those men, it's entirely possible that one of those men on that hill is my great-grandfather. I don't know, but he was there for the invasion and he was there for the occupation. He was there for 3.5 years before they shipped him off to an armed constabulary depot on the east coast. But Parihaka was invaded, and the restrictions on the production of food and on the movement of Māori people into, within and outside of the kāinga of Parihaka were maintained for 5 years. So there were pass laws long before they were invented in South Africa. Helen referred to those in the protest topic. You'll remember her talking about the apartheid pass laws. Well, we had them here quite some time before they became a feature of apartheid South Africa. And they were designed with much the same intention in mind, to restrict the movement of Māori into and out of an area which had caused the government no end of political strife. And it wasn't a benign occupation. There's a little quote here coming up from a book that I've written about this. And this sounds to me like it's just a terrible thing to do. You have people who are starving because their cultivations have been destroyed. Not just limited, but destroyed entirely. So you have very hungry people, starving people in Parihaka. You have strange natives, according to Native Minister John Bryce, who seek to come into the village to feed people with pork. And this is held to be, and was at the letter of the law, in contravention of government's regulations, which sought to restrict people's access to food. And so in retaliation for this, the armed constabulary, my great-grandfather included, tore down some more whare raupo. 12 families' houses were destroyed, but only after the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts, had removed all of the chattels which had been inside the houses. So they remained, but the houses which housed them were pulled down, in retaliation for people seeking to feed themselves or support others to be fed. So you have an invasion in 1881. You have an occupation that goes for 4 years, 5 years. My great-grandfather is there for most, but not all that time. And then he leaves. In 1887, the armed constabulary is disestablished, and he leaves the force and joins the newly formed permanent militia. He's a member of the artillery corps, and he's based in Port Chalmers and Dunedin for 4 years. He leaves there, and I lose sight of him for a couple of years. There were 2 or 3 years when I can't track him down. But then he returns to the coast. In other words, having been part of the military campaign to dispossess mana whenua around the Parihaka area. Parihaka is here. He returns as part of the agricultural campaign to complete the process. Again, I think you may have seen this briefly. You would be doing very well to remember it. I certainly can't recall what the context in which we talked about it. But what I do want to just talk about briefly are the 3 red dots. In 1895, my great-grandfather gets freehold title to this piece of land, section 44 in block 12 of the Cape Survey District. He pays 350 odd pounds for 114 acres. He gets to own this freehold because all of the land which had been confiscated from Māori and which was on the ocean side of the South Road was available for freehold title. Most of the land which was on the maunga or mountain side over here of the South Road had been promised to Māori in the form of native reserves. Most of that does not wind up being returned to Māori at all. In fact, these days, of the nearly 1,200,000 acres of land which were confiscated in 1865, only 20,000 remain in Māori ownership. The overwhelming majority of the rest of it has been sold out of Te Ao Māori into other people's histories, including those of my own family. So this happens in 1895. In 1902, this piece of land here, section 2 of block 13 of the Cape Survey District, my great-grandfather takes control of this. But this land, both then and now, is Māori land. It is part of the 20,000 odd hectares that remain in Māori land. This is land is subject to what is known as the West Coast leasehold system. I think it's also subject to the Māori Reserves legislation. I'm not entirely clear on that. But when my father signed a lease in 1902 on this land, he signed a very particular kind of lease. It's a form of lease provided for under the West Coast leasehold system that doesn't exist in any other form within this country. And there are some things about it which are important to note, I think. One is that the rent that he pays on that land is not determined by the Māori owners of the land. It's determined by a public official, a government official called the public trustee, who does not, according to the law under which he operated, and they were all his, does not need to consult with the owners of the land before determining the lease. And so many, possibly most, farms that were leased by non-Māori farmers under the West Coast leasehold system made available at leases which are lower than those which would have been negotiated on an open market. The Māori owners of that land cannot renegotiate leases. I guess of all of the details, and they are numerous. Perhaps the most disturbing detail is that the leases are in perpetuity. And that is quite literally what that word means. It means in operational terms that my great-grandfather has a lease for 21 years, and then at the end of the 21-year period, he gets to renegotiate it again. But he can keep on doing that in perpetuity. There was a slight increase in 1922 when he renegotiates the lease. It increases in value by £12, which means that over a 42-year period, the Māori owners of the land see their rental increased by £12. I don't know what that is as a if you were to express that as a percentage increase relative to inflation, the CPI at the time. But it doesn't sound to me like a terribly significant increase if you are looking at a period of 40 years, 42 years precisely, in which you get one rental increase, and it's £12. It seems to me that the Māori owners of the land, who have no say in any of this, are probably not maximising the returns on their land. And there was another aspect of all of this that is also really disturbing, which is that Māori who remained on their land, and there were some, were charged occupation licenses by the colonial state to live on their own land. Just as a side note, the arrangements around Māori leased land in the Taranaki area anyway, revised in the late 1990s. The rental review period was reduced from 21 to 7 years. Market rentals were introduced. There was considerable public support extended to the lease holders to offset the increases in rents that they would have to pay. But the leases themselves remain in perpetuity. In other words, there are still Māori people there who are unable to return to their own land, even though they own the land, because the land is subject to leases which have been awarded to non-Māori farmers in perpetuity. What else is there? I don't know if there's anything else that needs to be said just at this point. So I'll move on, but let me just have a brief kind of a pit stop here. So what we have is my ancestor coming from Ireland in 1874, joining the armed constabulary, contributing to the military part of the process of opening Taranaki up for settlement by removing, through actions of the New Zealand Parliament, Māori from their land and against their will. And then he returns to take advantage of that 10 years after he leaves the armed constabulary. And in time, he becomes, with his wife, Kate, who buys this section, section 102. Between the two of them, they control 3 pieces of land which are part of the entire section of Taranaki, which was confiscated from its rightful owners in September of 1865. There are some inconvenient truths about these arrangements. None of these are known in my family until I start researching and writing the book that I published finally late last year. I only began that process 5 years ago. But there are some things about those family farms that are not part of the stories that are told about home for us. And all of these things are taken from the parliamentary records, and nothing has been made up or called into existence. The next 2 or 3 slides of information which is available from what are called the ADJs, the appendices to the Journal of the House of Representatives, which is the government's official public record of activity. And in 1882, a surveyor writes to the minister saying, listen, essentially the quality of the surveying of roads and land in the Taranaki area is terrible. And it's a really serious obstacle to the accurate opening up of that area for settlement. Now, there aren't enough of them. They're incompetent. They go about their job in a rough and ready manner. There is a large proportion of errors in that work, and it all has to be done again. One of those errors, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you, my apologies if I have. One of those errors meant that the South Road, which we now call the Surf Highway, well, you might, I don't like the term. I prefer the South Road, which you drive through if you go up around the coast of Taranaki to New Plymouth from Hawera. That road is built closer to the mountain than it should have been. It should have been built sort of here, it's built over there. And so there is more land that is available for sale. And that is one of the pieces of land. So my great-grandfather benefits in that respect. There's a surveying error. He gets to have freehold title to the land. The land might otherwise have been available through the leasehold system only. 2 of those farms, the one that my great-grandmother Kate owns herself, section 102 of block 12, and the road, the Oparapa Road Farm, the one that they lease from the native trustee. Those are part of 5,000 acres of land which are held back from the proposal to return some land to Māori in the form of native reserves. It's entirely possible they would not have been returned anyway, because much of that land which was promised in the form of native reserves never eventuated for Mana Whenua. But those 2 pieces of land are part of the 5,000 acres that are held back to pay for the invasion. The languaging that the Crown uses suggests that somehow the invasion was inevitable, that it was necessary to suppress the Parihaka sedition. It's getting dark, I'm just going to turn the light on. We just need to be clear that what the Crown is really referring to here is a sedition that was peaceful and unlooked for and unwanted and unasked for. I don't think I have mentioned this part. There was a series of indemnifications that were offered in 1882. The second one took the form of an act that was passed 18 months or so after actually it can't even have been 18 months or so, it must have been within the year. Yeah, if it's the 7th of August, it's within 10 months or so of the invasion. It's an interesting piece of legislation. It's 1 page long. It's a really short piece of legislation. On the left-hand side there, if you just read down to the end, and you'll see in the final 3 lines, certain measures were adopted by the government of New Zealand. That's code for the invasion took place. Certain measures were adopted and carried out under the authority of the government, some of which may have been in excess of legal powers. Now that's code for stuff happened which was in breach of the law. The conditional language may have been in excess is conditional language. And it's given the lie by the fact that the colonial authority passed an Act of Parliament. You would think that if the measures may have been in excess, they might have been a little less exercised, but they were very exercised, and they got this Act of Parliament through the legislature very quickly. And the purpose of the legislation is to indemnify the people who may have acted in ways which were in excess of legal powers. The indemnification is extraordinary. Look on the right-hand side there. That is what it looks like. Anyone who found himself in such a position, in other words, who may have acted in excess of legal powers, shall be and hereby is freed, acquitted, released, indemnified, discharged of, from, and against all actions, suits, complaints, informations, indictments, prosecutions, liabilities, and proceedings whatsoever, and for all time. It's a very comprehensive out. It's a get out of jail card for people like my great-grandfather. I don't know what my great-grandfather did, but he was certainly party to both the invasion. Well, I say both, there were three things actually. He was certainly party to the invasion and the destruction of the village and its cultivations, and then the occupation. So it isn't really tenable, I think, for me to think that he was somehow not involved in measures which may have been in excess of legal powers. But it doesn't matter because he's rinsed clean through the 1882 indemnification legislation. It goes away. I was raised in the Roman Catholic faith. Some of you will have been as well, and you will know about the sacrament of confession, which is one of the imaginative ways in which the church has structured its relationship with people of the faith so that they can attend to the issue of sin. You go, you confess, your slate is wiped clean, you start again. We are fallible, we sin again, we go back. It's a sacrament which is problematic to explain to people who are not raised in that particular religious tradition. I think it's actually problematic to those of us who were. But in a way, when I look at that piece of legislation, I see a secular form of confession. What has happened is that the state's slate has been wiped clean. One of the things that happens as a consequence is those measures which may have been excess of the legal powers at the time, are forgotten. They don't form any part of any account that I have ever read of the involvement of the armed constabulary in the invasion and the subsequent destruction and occupation of Parihaka. They certainly weren't part of my family's stories. My family had very few stories to tell about Andrew Gilhooly, our great-grandfather, and I just wonder if this might have something to do with that. And there's a fourth inconvenient truth. There are a number of them. They all have to do with the land. They all have to do with whenua. They all have to do with places that were once some people's homes and then became other people's homes. If you just look over here, this is a screenshot, a blown up screenshot of the block in which my great-grandfather purchased the first piece of land. Section 44 is kind of halfway down the page. Section 1 of block 12 is this one. It's where the lighthouse is. It's a public reserve. It's not set aside for native reserves, as are some of these other white sections here. It's a public reserve. I think there were 4 in that block, a couple of gravel pits, and the reserve on which the lighthouse was constructed. This piece of land here, 18 acres from memory, this was leased, unusually it was leased to Māori. A chief called Whitu Moeata took out the lease on that land as people grew kumara there. In the 1950s, a woman with whom my mother had been at school, Mrs. Okaroa, represented the whānau who still held the lease. The whānau had been pressing the government for some years to convert the lease into freehold title. The government had been unwilling to allow that to occur. And in the early 1950s, if memory serves, it was 1955, Mrs. Okaroa quite literally walked into the department which controlled the lease. With the lease for renewal and the money to pay for the renewal of the lease. And the bloke sitting behind the desk refused to accept either. Quite simply, sat back and said, I don't know what he said. What I do know through the extraordinary kind of forensic research done by the Waitangi Tribunal, who unearthed this through the government's own records, is he simply refused to engage with Mrs. Okaroa wouldn't accept the lease, wouldn't accept payment. But within a week of having required her to return to her people on the Pangarehu Road with the lease unsigned, and I can only imagine, and not very well, how distressing that might have been, the lease is removed from them. Their rights as leaseholders are revoked because of non-payment of the lease. And the land is very quickly sold to the Pākehā farmer who owns these blocks. This map is from 1881. I'm talking about some events that occurred 70 years later. I have the name of that farmer. They were friends also of my mother's. So they purchased the land from the Māori whānau who had leased the land for 70 years and grown kumara, and who were prevented from renewing their lease, and on that basis had it removed from them, not because they didn't want to pay or couldn't pay or were bad tenants, but because of the bloke from the government department. Now, this occurred in 1855. For me, it will always remain, I use this word advisedly, a perfect example of what people mean when they talk about institutional racism. It's a big term. It sounds imprecise. It sounds like it's something that happens up here that's beyond this level. But that's what it looks like. When an institution, a government department, works in ways which promote ideas which discriminate against Māori people, in this case, that's what it looks like. It looks like a bloke sitting behind a desk, not accepting the money from Mrs. Okaroa, but then on that basis, selling her family's land to the farmer next door. The phrase "in the dementia wing" is one that I've taken from a woman called Rachel Buchanan. Rachel Buchanan is Te Atiawa iwi on her dad's side and Pākehā on her mum's side. Her dad was my GP when I was a kid. Rachel Buchanan and I did a little bit of amateur theatre together. We were in The Wizard of Oz. I was the Tin Man. She was Dorothy. She had the lead role. She was a bit younger than me, and I don't recall having a lot to do with her. But she has become somebody who I read voraciously. She's done. She works in Melbourne. She's the senior archivist at the Germaine Greer Archives, as I recall, and she's written some just intellectually, politically, emotionally, historically, in every other respect, really outstanding work on parihaka and relationships. And she wrote a book called the Parihaka Album, Lest We Forget. And she uses that final phrase intentionally. Lest we forget is the phrase that we tend to invoke around Anzac. Even in that context, it's problematic because we have actually chosen to forget a lot about Anzac, and we'll talk about that in the last, or one of the last topics of the course. I think it's topic 10. But Rachel talks about memory and loss, memory and forgetting. She uses the phrase "in the dementia wing" because her family became involved in the development of the land on which Athletic Park used to stand in Wellington. Her part of Te Atiawa didn't come home after the Heke South during the Muscat Wars. They remained in the Te Whanganui-Atara, the Wellington region. And that Papakainga housing, elderly persons housing complex on Adelaide Road, where Athletic Park used to be, has a dementia wing, and it's called the Rawinia Buchanan Dementia Wing. It's named after her grandmother. Rachel's grandmother died in that wing. Rachel's mother died in the Rawinia Buchanan Dementia Wing. And Rachel has taken that term "in the dementia wing" and she uses it to refer to people like me, who she uses it in a particular way. She talks about the dementia wing as the place where you go to forget things. She has a really interesting approach to the notion and the nature of forgetting. When Rachel talks about forgetting, specifically in the context of parihaka, she talks about it as something that is not accidental. Forgetting is something that you have to work quite hard at. It's purposeful. It doesn't happen just because. It happens by design. Usually when we talk about forgetting, it's associated with a sense of loss. I have forgotten who you are. This person I have lived with my entire life. I have Alzheimer's and I have forgotten who you are. There are, and you will know there can be profound loss associated with forgetting a thing, a name, a person, an event, an occurrence. But in the case of families like mine, there is also something to be gained by forgetting. And that's why I find the language of the dementia wing and Rachel's particular position on forgetting important, and I find it really compelling. It helps me to make sense of the fact that I grew up Waterstop with many stories about my people's time on the coast, not one of which included the detail that I've just walked you quietly through. All of my stories begin with the purchase of the family farm. None of them referred to the armed constabulary. None of them referred to land confiscations. None of them referred to an invidious leasehold scheme. All of those things have been forgotten, but other things have been remembered. So there are choices that have been invoked to ensure that the narrative that my family tells about home on the coast looks a particular way that is quite different from the way that it looks when you tell the unsettled story. There are other things to be gained, I think, by forgetting. There are some things that I get to do, and I quite consciously speak in the first person singular because I don't yet feel it's my place to attribute things that apply in my personal circumstances to other people. But it would not greatly surprise me if I were not the only person who grew up on confiscated land, if not in Taranaki, perhaps in the Waikato or the Bay of Plenty, who has forgotten some things, but remembered the kinds of things that allow me to be a part of the settler story. They allow me to be part of the story that says farming people have been, are, and forever shall remain the backbone of the nation. Forgetting the circumstances in which my people came into control of those 3 family farms means that I get to move on and I get to get over it. And I get to tell the story of being one people. But alongside of that, in the shadows, there are other stories that are there, sitting alongside of me in the dementia wing, just out of sight, just beyond peripheral vision. There's the unsettled story. In Taranaki, it has become my view that you cannot tell the settler story without acknowledging the unsettling effects on mana whenua of the arrival of my people. You cannot tell a settler story about those 3 Gilhooly farms without acknowledging that at one point in time, that land belonged to other people, that it was taken from them against their will and harnessed to the histories of my family. You can't really credibly or legitimately use the language of moving on, I think, without acknowledging that unsettled story. To do so is to indulge in historical ignorance and a form of dishonesty. It is a form of affective lying to willfully forget and to re-forget and to keep on forgetting the circumstances in which that sense of home was constructed on the coast as one of gross dishonesty. It is not a matter of indulging in guilt. As a Roman Catholic, I know my way around guilt intimately, and I have reached a position where I find it a profoundly non-productive emotion to indulge in, and it can be indulgent. Because what happens when you feel guilty is you say to other people, make me feel better about myself. tell me what a good person I am. Or you resort to violence and anger. That's the other response that guilt can sometimes trigger. Neither of those are especially helpful. So it is not a matter of guilt. It is a matter of being honest and telling a more accurate story, I think. I think it's difficult to rehearse that we are one people story when one of those people have been dispossessed and the other has benefited from that act of dispossession. It seems to me to be asking rather a lot of Taranaki Māori to subscribe to the we are one people narrative, considering the facts recorded by the government of its own actions. And let me talk about history and the blurring of the divisions between the past and the present and the future shortly. But I would just point out quietly that with the exception of those 20,000 odd acres, all of that land remains confiscated, and most of it is now passed well beyond the realm of Te Ao Māori. So it seems to me that speaking of the circumstances before the purchase of the family farms is something that I certainly didn't do. My family didn't do. And I think that if I reflect on the literature that I have read around settlement, and you think about those settler stories, they tend not to incorporate the deep history of the land. They start with the purchase of the family farm or with the arrival of the boat in Christchurch or whatever the case may be. There is another part to this. I don't know that I want to go into it necessarily, actually. I mean, I would, but I don't think it's actually relevant to the topic, which has to do with the paradox of the fact that my Irish ancestors came out of poverty and lived on land that had been confiscated from Indigenous Irish people by English colonisers, lived on land over which the Irish constabulary exercised a non-benevolent, violent custodianship, but then came to a new land and indulged in exactly those practices and benefited from the dispossession of another people. There is a significant paradox there for those of us who are from people who are poor tenant Irish farmers and who came and changed their lives and created vastly better lives on the basis of the dispossession of other people. I do want to talk a wee bit about that, I think, and this is the bit that I found the most challenging, but also the most, I have found this the most, what's the word I'm looking for? I was going to use the word liberating. I don't think that's right. This is the point in the story at which, the point in the process of writing that small book of mine, which is just sitting off screen over there, where I thought, oh, that's it. That's the big reveal. A woman called Charlotte MacDonald, who's a history professor at Victoria University in Wellington, has this lovely phrase about the mistaken notion that the past exists behind a closed door. It's sealed off from the present, and that quote goes on to describe the conventional notion of the past as being something that is over and done, which is certainly the one that I grew up with, as referring to a series of dead acts lacking the capacity to influence our lives today. I would have signed up to that orthodox view of the distinction between the past and the present and possibly the future until about 4.5 years ago, and I profoundly contest that notion now. What has become very clear to me is that the consequences of those actions that occurred in 1863 and 1865 and 1881 and 1895 and 1902 and 1922, those consequences continue to flow through into my present. And here are just 4 snapshots of that. I use the language of privilege. I would have used the language of structural advantage once upon a time, but the conventional languages of privilege, much like notions of institutional racism, this was a concept that I just struggled to, being relatively well endowed with privilege, as you can tell, white, male, middle-aged, professorial. I know that Roxane Gay doesn't like us to indulge in privilege Olympics, but depending on your position on the notion of privilege Olympics, I either lose everything or I win everything. But the explanatory power of that concept has become very clear to me through the work that I've done on the family. So here are some things that I just want you to have a look at. There's a lot of money there. None of it is going to the people who were on the land for 5, 6, 7, 800 years before my people arrived. None of it goes to Taranaki iwi. None of it goes to mana whenua. It goes to my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. It flows through the process of inheritance to their children, including, point number 4, my great-uncle Dick, who was Andrew Gilhooly's. He was the second youngest son. He became a Roman Catholic priest. He's a fascinating person in his own right. But in his history, there is no mention of parihaka whatsoever. There is no mention of invasions. There is no mention of occupations or confiscations. There's no mention of Māori at all. There is a really complex and a satisfying and an intriguing history of the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and Taranaki, involving the French in the first instance and then the Irish. And Dick was part of a wave of a kind of a Gallic takeover of the Roman Catholic political establishment in Rome. He was sent to Rome to study. He graduated at the age of 20 with 3 degrees, including a PhD, which he knocked off in 18 months. He contracted tuberculosis in Rome. He came home and he died, a young man. When he died, he left close to $250,000 in today's terms to his 2 sisters, who were the sole remaining family members at that point. He is a priest. They have limited earning capacity. I can reach no other conclusion than that land or that money was his share of the family inheritance. It flows through to his sisters. In turn, it flows through into other family members. It helps pay for the purchase of houses, the cost of education. It helps pay for trips overseas. It pays for all of those small things through which we construct our sense of self in our homes and in our locales and in our communities. It flows on down through the years. It's a living inheritance. If you read the economics literature, you'll see that one of the most powerful determinants of any person's wealth or lack of is the extent to which they inherit. Clearly, to some degree, we exercise some agency. There is merit involved in this. But you don't have to look terribly far. You will know people. You may have been at school at them. You may be one of them, whose position is often claimed to be a function of hard work and individual merit. And that may well be a part of the story, but behind you is your family. Behind you is the farm. Behind you is the trust fund. Behind you are the stocks and shares. Behind you is inheritance. This is a part of my inheritance. Nobody made gazillions of dollars out of those farms. They were relatively small. They had small herd sizes, but they were established. They comprise a platform and a basis upon which a family established themselves coming out of Ireland into this place. And the material and the intangible benefits continue to flow on down through the generations. And so that's what institutionalized privilege looks like to me. And so it is no longer possible for me to think that the past is something that happened. It's over. We can move on now. That self-serving distinction has been forever erased for me. And so what I have sought to do, and this is, I'll start bringing it back to the conceptual template for this module shortly. What I've sought to do is to end the forgetting. But in the process of doing so, let me just come on to this last one. In the process of, I've managed that segue very well. I want to go back to this. The business of ending the forgetting or leaving the dementia wing and remaining out of it. What you have there is a small section of the map demonstrating the confiscation. So the confiscation line runs from the northeast down towards the southwest and then back into the southeast. And all of that land is summarily confiscated in September of 1865. It's divvied up. And very little of it remains in Māori hands. But I have forgotten all of that context. We talk about context in this course, all the context that went into the formation of my family's story about home on the coast, this area around here. It's all been forgotten, except that I've brought it back into the light. And the final point that I want to make apropos of the history in particular is how much context matters to understanding my sense of self. And it's just a brief thing. And what happens is this: every time I go home to New Plymouth, and I'm going home in a couple of days' time to spend a little bit of time with my mum and to give a talk, which won't be terribly dissimilar to this actually at Pukeariki, New Plymouth. I drive up the South Road. It's a really beautiful road. Even on a bad day, it's a beautiful road. And I look around and I see landscape that I know through the work I've done and through some of the relationships with Taranaki Māori that I have, that other people who drive that same road see a trauma-scape. What I see as something from which my family have gained is something which theirs have lost. There are mana whenua in Taranaki who have never set foot on their maunga because of the deep sense of shame that is felt about having lost the maunga, having lost the language, having lost the pa. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of pa sites that no longer exist, that used to be features of the landscape in Taranaki, but which have been erased, quite literally, physically erased, through processes of dispossession, confiscation, invasion, and so on. And for the better part of my life, I forgot that, and I use the word forgetting in a slightly imaginative fashion. I don't mean that I knew it and I forgot it. I mean that I just never bothered to find out about it, which I think amounts to much the same thing. I knew that of Parihaka, I knew that stuff had happened, but easy for me and impossible for others just to continue to forget it and to walk away from it. Let me come back to some of just a couple of points that I hope will make sense of this in the context of the topic. Even though it has been 30 years since I've lived on the coast or in Taranaki, mostly New Plymouth, I spent very little time living on the coast, that is still the place that I reach for. If people say, well, where do you come from? I will say, well, there's a bit of me that comes from Palmy, and there's a bit from France, where my partner's from, but really I'm from the Taranaki coast. That's where my people come from. If I think backwards in time from where I came from, that's where I came from. So what I've been describing to you for the last however long it has been, and I'm going to wrap it up soon, is a sense of where I locate myself in spatial terms that is a consequence of interactions between people and places, and one particular place in particular, which we'll call the coast. The relationships that have played out across the history of my people's time there have been saturated with power. Typically, the power has been asymmetrically distributed between parties. Most obviously, if you look at the exercise of state power, both in the context of the armed constabulary, the confiscation and the sale of land to my great-grandfather, power is very clearly present there, and it has been used in particular ends and towards particular destinations, which benefit some people and which do considerable violence and damage to other people. Such that my family have been able to create a story, my family's creation story on my mother's side. My father's side is a different matter altogether. The creation story is based upon communities, religious communities, rugby playing communities, beer drinking communities, farming communities, which come out of that land that was secured or appropriated or gained through the exercise of power. just a couple of final points connecting back to Mehana's and Trudy's videos, which you may well not have watched. They're only short, they're like 12, 15 minutes long. Have a look at them afterwards, and some of this might make more sense. The first point is that the notion of home applies at different scales. Trudy will talk about the home, like the house. I'm talking about a sense of home at a different scale, but it is definitely home. For me, the coast is the place where I come from, and that sense travels with me, whether I'm living in London or in France or in Palmerston North. That is the place that I'm looking at general direction now, that I turn to if people say, where are you from? So I come from the Taranaki coast. And that is a part of the way in which I ground myself. So my understanding of the notion of ontological security would say, well, yeah, that's part of the creation story. For me, that's the sense making. The story is I come from that place. And there is a sense of wellness and security which comes with that. I imagine that the experience for people whose land was taken from them in order to provide the material conditions for my family's sense of ontological security is the absolute reverse of that, but it's not my place to comment on their behalf. And so my story, which won't be yours, you will have your own histories, and I'm not suggesting, there's nothing in what I've said that suggests that you need to subscribe to this particular sense making, this particular narrative or account that I've told. But in my mum's family on that side, our sense of self has been constructed at the expense of other people's sense of self. And what was a place that in Mehana's terms constituted the Turanga Waiwai of Manawhenua in Taranaki is now a series of places that are other people's homes. So the notion of home is a seductively easy, straightforward looking one, simple. I say that with in full acknowledgement of the fact that for many of us, you, home is sometimes, perhaps always, not simple, often not safe at all, often a place in which we are the recipients of emotional or rhetorical or sexual or physical violence and harm. Home can protect people who perpetrate that kind of damage. What I'm suggesting is at another scale, if I spool up to that larger scale, that sense of home that I have when I think about the Taranaki coast, that sense that I have in my drive mum, as I will do. I do it every time I go home. She says, let's just go for a drive down the coast. We go for a drive. And I have a sense of being in a place that is familiar to me. But that sense has come at the price of another people's sense of home. So there is complexity to this apparently simple, straightforward notion of home. And let me end by just inviting you to sit with that notion of complexity and have a think about the extent to which it is part of your own stories of home, whatever they may be. All right, I'm going to stop the sharing now. I am going to go away and make dinner and have a quiet drink. Thank you for listening. Hope your mid-semester breaks went really well. We'll see you at tutorials later in the week, and I will see you on Monday of next week. If you've got any questions or comments or concerns or things you want to contribute in response to this, use the what do we call them? Forum functions on stream. Okay, see you soon.